Hi, I'm Andy Kirschman. I farm about an hour north up at Hilda. Dry land, all dry land, more dry land this year than some years. This is Rob Dunn, and he's a consultant, and I'll let him introduce himself more than that.
Yeah, so worked with Alberta Agriculture in Lethbridge. Most of the fun part of my career was down in Lethbridge, kind of working in soil conservation, soil and cropping systems, worked as a crop specialist for a while. When I retired from Alberta Agriculture, or I should say graduated from Alberta Agriculture in 2014, started a company, FarmWise Inc., and worked with Andy's part of a peer group, a number of young guys, and I saw Scott in the crowd here as part of that.
He's not as young.
He's not as young, but yeah, and then there's a bunch of old guys that sort of, that I work with, a group of 12, really a bunch of guys that are all a lot smarter than me, and as you'll see here today with Andy, it's fun working with these guys and do a little bit of consulting work with Alberta Pulse Growers on the Plot to Field program. But yeah, glad to be here today, and good to see you out. Wanted to just kind of make some sort of high level comments just as we kind of get rolling here. And then Andy is, I think, one of the guys in Western Canada that is probably as experienced, or maybe as experienced as any, with kind of intercropping and kind of exploring some of these ideas. So when Jamie called here, I guess a couple of months ago, I said, well, we really need to have Andy there, or better yet, I don't even need to be here. You just kind of get Andy, and he kind of knows this stuff inside and out, and really sort of caveat most of the stuff we talk about today is that there's a lot of great stuff on Twitter and a lot of great stuff on, in the popular press in terms of this whole idea of intercropping. And so intercropping, I think, how many people in the crowd are, as agronomists or farmers, have some experience with intercropping? Just kind of a quick show of hands here. There's a few here selling into that. Yep, tried it. Yep. And so, intercropping isn't really new, in terms of on the prairies, but I think it's sort of risen in terms of some, popularity and interest probably over the last 10 years. And we see a lot of research trials getting started. It's really the idea of growing two crops together, 2 or 3 crops together, and then separating them at harvest. So we're talking about, with sort of the classic view of the definitions on intercropping, you'd be targeting a grain crop where we're trying to get some species that we can grow, that are complementary to one another, where we can sort of get the 1 + 1 is about 2.5 kind of idea in terms of getting some sort of elevation on the use of our, we call it a land equivalent ratio in terms of our crops. We're looking at something that we can obviously separate at harvest unless we're going to use it for a feed. The other kind of idea, and we're not sort of seeing this in terms of the demos that we've got here today, but really an important one is the whole idea of kind of companion cropping. And so you see this a bit more on irrigation. I think there's obviously potential on dry land as well. So where you're growing one principal crop for grain, but you've got another crop that's providing some service in terms of weed suppression, in terms of soil health, but it's also then there as possible grazing, right? So we might be taking that off as a feed or a grain, and then that companion crop is giving us something later in the summer. So again, challenging conditions this year for anything, but we want to leave kind of lots of time for sort of discussion here on this one, but I'm going to kind of turn it over to Andy to talk a little bit about what he's doing up in his farm, and we'll kind of do a walkthrough on the nice plots that Farming Smarters put together here. So
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, lots of time. That's because I didn't prepare that much. So, but it's for questions at the end. Don't worry. That's what we planned with. I'll just do a little quick history of what I have done intercropping, and then kind of where I see we're going, and then some of the ideas behind it. If you have any questions, just stop me and let me know. I think it was 2008 when I started with 20 acres of yellow peas and clearfield canola. I think it was 2008. It was kind of the last year you could get 7120 CL DeKalb. I ended up having to swath it because the maturities, even though 7120 was one of the shortest season clearfield canolas, maturity just didn't match up. Combined it and then thought, boy, we should probably separate this. So we put it in a bin for a year, and There are horror stories about binning intercrops together, but we didn't have a problem. It was a small bin. It was not a lot of stuff. And after a year, we thought maybe we should do something with it. So we took our old TR98 combine, tightened the sieves up, took the return door off the bottom, put an auger out of there, and the peas went in the grain tank, or the canola went in the grain tank, and the peas came out the return, and it actually worked pretty well. But there are definitely better and cheaper ways of doing it. Of course, with a TR98, maybe there's no cheaper way of doing it these days. Moved on to, kind of took a couple of years off, I guess. Moved more into a companion cropping with Clearfield canola as well, and with a sweet clover. So everything was seeded at the same time, full rate of canola and about 3 pounds of sweet clover. The idea is sweet clover is a biennial. You swath and combine the canola off of it, and that next year as a biennial, the sweet clover comes back. By about this time, that second year, sweet clover is in full bloom, and it's a good chance to terminate it. We always just terminated with herbicide. Was really good. Ran a disc drill, we just went and seeded straight into it. That was 6 years ago, I think, the last time we did it. We can still see the lines in the fields from where we did that. So don't ask me why we still don't do it, because it obviously made a difference. One thing is, I don't like running the swather. And with sweet clover is quite frost tolerant. Canola is not. So if you get a frost in the early spring when that canola is just out of the ground, that sweet clover gets ahead of it real quick. And you will have yellow flowers that year, but sometimes it's not canola and the sweet clover is 18 inches above it. So swathing is pretty much a necessity with it. I think there are some other legumes, forage legumes, that would work, and that's something that we have to work on a little bit more. I've got some ideas, but as everyone knows in southern Alberta, Clearfield chemistry isn't exactly killing any weeds these days, so maybe it's not that big of a deal not using it, but it's nice because all of your forage legumes are tolerant to Clearfield, but so are all of our weeds. The most done intercrop that I've done has been peas and yellow mustard. Yellow mustard, a choice because flea beetles don't hit it as much as the other ones, but more importantly to me, cabbage seed pod weevil, it's resistant to, which means you're not worrying about spraying at bloom when the beneficial insects are in there. Another reason to choose yellow mustard above some of the other brassicas has been it's really not a high yielding crop. So if you can grow a little bit of something else with it, all of a sudden your margins and your return for that year come up without suppressing yield. So it's kind of helpful in that way. I've grown it with yellow peas, with dun peas, with maple peas. The thing about growing it with peas and a brassica is the trellising effect. You don't see it really in yellow peas, which is what's here because that's what the seed was there, and you're not going to see it anyway until harvest, but some of the higher value pea crops that we grow are higher value because they are so horrible to harvest, so nobody wants to do it. But if you have something you can trellis up, you'll see some of these, some of the tendrils are starting to grab onto the mustard plants in these plots. You have that ability to cut at 6 inches rather than at 0 inches, which that's quite beneficial in some years, especially years where it gets wet. Fall of 2016 was wet, and we found our intercrops. We were able to cut with the headers not in flex and still get everything, where the monocrops we had to put our auger head in flex, put it on the ground, and we had an intercrop of peas and dirt. So there's not a lot of margin in the dirt though. It's best to keep that in the field and not in the combine. So that's the pea mustard. So that's kind of what is here. The mustard, like we saw in the canola plots, anything small seeded this year wasn't great for emergence. You can see a little bit of the effects here. One thing I've noticed is that you will, as the trellising effect, you will have a little bit taller pea growth where it's near the mustard, and I think that's noticeable here as well. Flax and chickpeas, which is actually down here. I did that for 1 year. It turned dry 2017, and it was a problem. Not a problem like this here where the flax really didn't show up, but when it turned dry, I had good flax emergence and probably too much flax in the ground. And the problem was that the flax just choked the chickpeas out. Chickpeas needed late season moisture and we didn't get it. It was a beautiful looking crop until we took the combine in and we got our seed back on the chickpeas, and that wasn't that beneficial, I guess. But what was beneficial is there was no applied nitrogen, And that flax, once it was separated out, that flax yielded exactly the same as our monocrop flax that had 40 or 50 pounds of nitrogen on it. So there's something in there, but we are also talking about the year where chickpeas went to 65 cents. So I probably would have been better off selling those, just growing a straight chickpeas crop. But you can't live in the past, as we know in farming, because you have bins of things that aren't worth anything, but were worth a lot of things, a lot 2 years before.
Just a kind of a comment like Andy's saying, and that we noticed when we were just looking at this earlier today, the pure stands of the flax and the mustard look a little better, and obviously you're kind of nailing the seeding rate on those pure stands, but when you try and combine the two, and that's one of the things we'll maybe come back to and touch on, is the challenge is, you know, do you put it in the row, do you put it between the row? In our case with Ken's, the Farming Smarter drill, that's the pillar is side banding, so to speak, and so you're trying to put the, you know, chickpea or the pea down the row, down the fertilizer, where the fertilizer would go, and then the flax or the mustard off to the side. So it's one of those challenges on a year like this that kind of gets stranded, or maybe even a little bit too deep, a little too shallow. You never know. But yeah. Yeah,
that's for sure. And that's the thing. We'll come back. We'll talk a little bit of seeding tools, alternate or mixed rows. Finally, on the end here, and this is something that I tried this year. I can guarantee you that this plot of durum and peas and flax looks better than mine, because mine has unintended sow thistle intercrop as well. And I'm pretty sure that only the durum is going to survive the Infinity FX that it got 3 days ago. So that has changed. Has anyone noticed sow thistle is especially vibrant this year? I have. I think we sprayed too late in the fall. We had a frost that shut it down too fast. The Canada thistle we had much better control on, but the sow thistle was, I think it was too injured by our frosts, and we get to try it again this fall.
Perennial sow thistle.
Perennial sow thistle, yeah. It would have got glyphosate and Express last fall, but I think it was just too late, too hard of a frost. We're always waiting for that frost to get the Canada thistle to start putting reserves into the roots, but with the annual or the perennial sow thistle, it just didn't happen. So, such is life. That's one thing. We always get to do it again next year if we didn't get it right this year. So we'll move on to. Does anybody have any questions right now? Hector. Okay. Separation on this one here will probably be 2 passes through a grain cleaner. Basically, separation is going to happen on seed size primarily, quite possibly on density as well, and just if that's going to become an issue. With something like this, we would run it through the cleaner, probably take out the peas first, because that's a much larger seed size, and a much faster separation. Just based on size, it's going to be much easier to take the peas out of the flax and the durum, and then leave the flax and durum together and separate that out on a second pass. So that will be through, we've got a Jesdal 5-in-1 at home that works quite well for that. For things like mustard and peas, where you have a large seed size difference, something as simple as a rotary screen, a TR98, either way, that works quite well. Oh, for sure. Yeah, so you can see that it's quite easy to separate some of these things. It's quite hard to separate other ones. So that's something that if you're thinking about intercrops, don't do wheat and barley. That would probably be a bad idea.
So what about harvestability? Aren't you going to lose some shelling due to these differences in
Yes.
harvest?
So maturity is going to be a big deal as well. Flax-wise, I put it in just to have a non-brassica, just to try that. Peas and mustard, they line up pretty well. One thing you have to do is when you're looking at yellow peas, or especially some varieties of green peas, they will shatter quite a bit. Once you get into your maples, some of your more specialty peas, they don't shatter nearly as much. So variety choice or even species choice, that's something that's important. With your canola shattering and stuff like that, variety selection in there would be a difference. You're going to see your canola intercrops a little further north, I think. Down here it seems the yellow mustard is good, is better. Yeah, harvest management is an issue, definitely. So it's not a put the seed in the ground and then think later, now how am I going to do this? It's think about it all winter long, and then maybe don't do it that year, and then think about it another winter, and then and then go and do it. So, and then you'll still find out you didn't think about a lot of things.
So the PDEX one, we'll call that the Andy's PDEX. That's a more radical one.
Yeah.
Yep.
So Andy, at the end of the day, are you doing this for net return, or are you doing it for soil health? What are you doing this for?
I think there's a few reasons to do it depending on what your species selection is and what your year is. The year we did about 600 acres, we figured it out, and we would have netted $50 an acre more after cleaning costs. That's over and above what the peas would have yielded when we put the mustard in. The peas didn't yield quite as much as monocrop peas, but that 5 bushels of mustard bumped it up quite a bit further that was there. I think in a wet year, that trellising effect for harvestability is going to make a difference. It might give you increased ground speed, might be less potential combine damage just because you don't have to be on the ground, especially if it's a wet harvest. We noticed when we were doing the monocrop peas, and this was monocrop Austrian winter peas, and Austrian winter peas will grow 6 feet tall, and then when you go to harvest them, they're 6 centimeters tall. So in that case, if you can hold that crop up 6 inches, you're either going to dry your ground out easier because you don't have that mat laying on the ground, or even if the ground is wet, you're not always touching that ground, that wet ground with a combine header, so you're not dragging piles all the time. There's nothing more frustrating than spending more time backing the combine up, clearing piles out than you are going forward. So I think there's a benefit in that.
The cost of every time you run it through the cleaner?
We probably would value it about 30 cents a bushel would be, because we own the cleaner, especially with the rotary cleaner. I would think if we were running through our seed cleaner, I'd be more like 50 cents. So you have to definitely value it in that way too. There's the hassle of that. I mean, you're rebinning and stuff like that too. At harvest time, we hear lots of things about you can't leave them together, and we never have had an issue with that. It seems if the peas are dry enough, it seems that moisture, even if the canola or that mustard is a little bit damp, that moisture will wick out of there. I know PAMI was going to start doing some moisture equivalency. The idea being that canola at 10% moisture or mustard at 10% moisture maybe isn't the same as peas at 10% moisture. Maybe a pea at 13% moisture will actually take moisture out of canola at 10%. And they're going to do some work on that and see that. But I think it would be as simple as taking samples of crops at certain moistures that you know, bagging them together so that moisture can't go anywhere, and then re-separating them and doing a moisture test on that just to see which way that moisture goes. So I think that there's more work that needs to be done for that. When it comes down to it, if you can put it in an air bin and it comes off dry, you're going to be way happier than taking it out of a not air bin with a shovel or a pick or a drill.
So everything you got is under air?
Everything that we'll put intercrop into will have air. I mean, the big thing is just keep it cool too. And that way you're not so rushed. We've had long harvests for a few years. You're not thinking, well, we got to get the combine out in the field and do some harvesting, but we also have to have 2 swing augers set up so that we can separate this intercrop. So it just gives you a little bit more time if you can get it cool.
So what moisture do you shoot for when you start combine?
I shoot for dry, and usually that's dry. The peas will probably be 13% by the time that mustard's down. The maturities still don't line up perfectly, so there is an issue. Desiccation would be an option, I think.
How would you decide on the seed ratios?
So seeding rate, there's been some talk about it. There's been talk about, so if you think about your seeding rates as 100%, so just yellow mustard would be 10 pounds an acre. That would be your 100% monocrop seeding rate. For peas, you would be 180 pounds. These are just kind of your standard, your accepted ideas here. You'd be at 180% or 180 pounds. That's your 100% rates. In dry, I would say in the brown soil zone, you would be looking to try to get to 100% equivalent seeding rate. So if you, and I think probably you want to bias towards the legumes depending on what you want to do for fertility. It also depends on which your higher value crop is. One of the things about including something like peas or lentils in an intercrop is that there is some documented but not well documented sharing of nitrogen between a legume and the companion crop. The thing about mustard is it's a brassica, it's non-mycorrhizal. There still is some sort of a sharing in that network there, be it root sloughing or something like that, but it's still a question mark that hasn't really been filled in yet on how or if it's a significant amount of nutrient sharing between them.
And there's some good studies started at Lethbridge just going into year 2. Eric Bremer and Dune Colley have some really good studies looking at that, where they label the nitrogen and they're kind of looking at some of those,
to see if there is nutrient flow from species to species. So when I've been setting up my intercrop seeding rates, I've been going 2/3 of my seeding rate of the legume and 1/3 of the seeding rate of the other crop, so of the brassica. That takes a little bit of tweaking, I think, depending on it, what you're growing, how competitive some of those crops are. So with peas at 100%, you're at 180 pounds. If I want to go to 2/3, I'll be at 120 pounds. With yellow mustard at 10 pounds, if I want to go to 1/3, so 33%, I'm at just over 3 pounds. So I'm trying to keep my seeding rates as a percentage kind of to where that level should be. Other areas of the prairies, they've been recommending 125%. When it turns dry, that's too much. We've found that. Even the year we did 600 acres, we had done that. So that was kind of we were doing 2/3 a rate of peas and half a rate of mustard. And it just, when the rain stopped, everything stopped. You grew too many plants at that time. So it's really important in the brown soil zone to keep those seeding rates where the recommended is, and then run it from there, make your adjustments from there.
So everything's down one tube here, but have you ever done anything down mid-row?
Yeah, so that's your kind of the question of mixed versus alternate rows. The data I've seen is most of the time mixed is just fine. I think when it gets dry though, I think alternate rows or keeping them in separate rows is going to make sense. I noticed, and maybe that will mitigate a little bit of seeding rate mistakes. When I did flax and chickpeas, I did 2/3 rate of chickpeas, and it would have ended up being probably about half rate of flax, and those were in the same row. And the flax at 20 pounds an acre, it overwhelmed the chickpeas when it turned dry that year. I think in an alternating row setup, I think it would have been much better, because you would have had those chickpeas using moisture those chickpeas would have had some moisture to use that the flax originally took up. So I think there's something for that to say. Once it gets wet, and this is where they really see the benefit of alternating rows, is with chickpeas and flax. Once it gets wet, if you alternate those rows, you have a disease break. So you have 2 rows of chickpeas and 2 rows of flax. If you start getting Assacarta in those chickpeas, you have 20 or 25 inches of space in between that next row of chickpeas where you don't have the wet leaves touching each other at least. So maybe you have a little bit more time to get out there. Maybe if it's wet and you have a patch that's got disease and it turns dry, it kind of is isolated compared to moving through that whole field. So that's where the alternating rows have really shown in the wet years, in the disease-prone crops, that makes a difference there.
And some of that research is started now. The farmers, as you can kind of imagine, the farmers are way ahead of most of the research on this, which is, often the case. I mean, so the research is kind of catching up to sort of understand mechanisms, understand some of those things. Shama Chatterton, she's in Lethbridge and works as a pathologist, principally on pulses, and she's looking at cover crops and possibly even intercrops in the future, looking at that in terms of effect of Aphanomyces, which is such a plague for us on the prairies right now with lentils and peas. And so just to capture Doug's question there, some of the other reasons why, obviously, and Andy's touched on it with chickpea, and I think there's probably some other things there that in terms of reasons. Just one more reason that doesn't relate so much to what's happening here at Medicine Hat, but for those that are coming from the west or from the northwest, so you look at, there's some thought about chickpea intercrops with flax, for example, or a flax intercrop with a a sort of lentil flax intercrop has maybe just being able to hasten maturity on some of these crops when we do get into moisture in late July or August. So there is, again, some thought about, you know, can we push the maturity of these crops if we have them together. So that's the other thing that's being looked at.
Yeah, very much so in an indeterminate crop like some lentils and your chickpeas. If you do get that late season moisture, at least you've got flax there that's able to use some of that moisture up rather than flowering into October or November. So there may be a benefit to that as well.
You touch on the insects for a bit?
Oh, you can touch on that.
I can just mention, so we actually, so Andy and Scott and another farmer we work with in kind of the peer support group over by Claresholm, we kind of had a look at this 3 years ago, Andy?
Whenever the snake was there.
Yeah, and basically sort of definitely, you know, in terms of looking at strips of monoculture versus intercrops within, you know, on a field scale. And there was some sites were replicated, some weren't. You could certainly see at the time of flowering for canola insect, there was less preference, you know, in the intercrop. Of course, we have less canola plants there, but just the idea is that when you get that interference from two different crops, does it kind of, you know, throw our bugs off a little bit, our balance? We think maybe similar things with foliar diseases and that sort of thing. Andy mentioned it with the chickpea, flax and the chickpea. So there's some interactions there with insects. We did not see any difference at the time of emergence on pea leaf weevil or flea beetle. There was no flea beetles that year. Would have been a good year to try it this year. But Hector, have you seen anything, I guess?
We did a study with triticale and yellow peas and triticale and forage peas, also intercrop. We didn't see any effect on foliage damage for flea beetle. So I was curious if in your polyculture here, where you actually have 3 crops, maybe you are seeing a reduction in the notches by the flea beetle. Is this untreated seed?
I don't know. Is this untreated seed?
Do you
Cruiser
pick on
or
this, maybe? Not sure.
Probably has a neonate.
probably
Probably
treated?
treated.
Okay.
Probably treated
And
seed.
they're judging from the faba beans, there's probably no pea leaf weevil within a
Yeah.
few kilometers.
Yeah.
But having said that, you know, the more diversity that you get, the more potential, even at an early stage, like a pea leaf weevil or a flea beetle is kind of maybe not as distracted, but it is possible that we'll see some benefit. But we certainly saw it when, you know, with cabbage, seed pod weevil, and lygus, there was certainly less, you know, less at that stage. And so,
Andy, in dry conditions and intercropping the following year, is there less crop or is there more crop?
I would think, one thing that I noticed is when you're adding mustard into peas, even at lower rates, your residue is much more persistent. Just because you have something with a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio with that mustard stubble in there, so you don't lose your cover quite as fast of your stubble. I think it will use more moisture though. Your peas are only going to go 24 to 30 inches down in a good year. Your mustard, or even once you get into canolas, it's probably going to use moisture below there. So if you're using into that reserve and not replenishing it, there definitely will be an issue in that way. Maybe if you do have a little bit more residue cover that persists longer, maybe that mitigates that, but you still have to have moisture in the ground so that you can conserve that moisture.
so snow catch might be a little better.
That's true too. Yeah, so snow, if you can cut 6-inch stubble rather than no inch stubble, you might catch a little bit of snow. It might not all end up in your trees in your yard, but it still probably will. I guess the one thing too would be herbicides. Herbicides are going to be an issue. There are more and more options. Flax and chickpeas, you have something like Authority that is registered on both of those. That is an option. Doug, is mustard on the Authority label now? So you've got mustard with your mustard and pea intercrop. You've got some options like that. You start talking about canolas. You have Clearfield canola that you could go with Clearfield lentils, things like that too. So there are some options out there, but you definitely have to do some digging, some variety selection. That's important too. And maybe you have to start looking at some labels where there are some labels out there, some crops on some labels that we don't think about anymore, but MCPA is registered on peas. MCPA amine, so there is some options there. I don't think MCPA kills anything anymore, but at least you can feel good driving your sprayer over top of it that you might kill something. You'll at least kill the weeds you drive over. So yeah, we've dealt with some of the seeding stuff, with the herbicides, with harvest and harvest separation. I guess there's one interesting thing that I've tried for a couple of years. It's not nearly as sexy as growing 2 different or 3 different things in that flower differently, but there is some data out of, I believe it's Iran of all places, about growing the same species of crops but different varieties of them. And the idea behind that is that some varieties of crops will be better in different droughts or different stress situations than other varieties, be it plant heights or disease tolerance or something like that. So growing 2 or 3 or 4 varieties of the same crop, and I mean we can do it in Western Canada because as long as you're delivering hard red spring wheat, it doesn't matter what hard red spring wheat is. Durum is the same way, peas are the same way. You could still do that and grow them together and still market them the same. But there may be something in there, and I can tell you if you grow Brigade Durum with black beards and Durum with different colored beards, you get a lot of questions from your dad. What did you do there? When you see swaths of black and everything like that. But it's really interesting when you have maybe bearded and unbearded varieties or different colored bearded varieties to see what parts of the fields that the different varieties perform better in. Some areas, we noticed it with Brigade Durum, you would have kind of the lower areas you'd have more of those dark beards, and then in the hilltops you'd have more of the other varieties there. So it's kind of interesting in that way to see. That's a way to intercrop. You're not really adding diversity, and other than you've got different varieties there, but you're also not worrying about separation. You're not worrying about chemicals unless you have a Clearfield wheat and you forgot some of your wheat isn't a Clearfield wheat. But you have some options there too. You have that in peas. You have lots of different ideas in there. I think it's interesting if you get the emails from Stamp Seeds every once in a while, they'll have variety trials, and then at the end they just throw everything together and seed them out. And quite often that's the highest yielding treatment when they do their variety trials on their farm. So it's kind of interesting. And I don't think you want to go to your seed grower and say, okay, I'm going to pull under this auger and we're going to fill here, and then we're going to go there, and then we're going to go there, because their head might explode after they've spent all of this time trying to grow this perfect pure seed, and then you go mix it all up in your drill or in your. So wait till you get home to mix it. Don't make them do it in their yard. Any questions?
Andy, have you tried doing any relay cropping yet, or have you been looking into that as well?
I have looked into relay cropping. Relay cropping would be you grow a crop, probably in this area it would be a winter cereal, and then come in the spring you go and you seed into it something else. Maybe something like lentils or peas, something that those maturities will almost match right up. So you could do that. Another relay crop that we see out of the States quite a bit is winter wheat, and then in the spring they go drill soybeans into it. The winter wheat matures, the soybeans are still in the understory, so that winter wheat is harvested off the top and then the soybeans come. So 2 kind of different ways of relay cropping, looking at it. I think it has merit. I don't think it rained this year.
Could that work with that canola and then sweet clover, if you could go back and put the sweet clover in once you've got a good canola stand? I
think so. I think that would work. That would mitigate it. Your canola would have a chance to get ahead of it much better. I'm lazy or efficient, whichever way you want to look at it, but if I have to go out in the field, I want to do everything in one pass, and maybe I'm losing out on some things like that, but it's something that I think we can look at. I think in your longer growing season areas or your higher moisture areas, I think relay cropping would be something interesting to look at. Often you're able to go with your second crop after your herbicide pass, or you're going to get at least emergence after your herbicide pass, so you don't have the herbicide issues. You can still, to a point, I mean, if you're putting dicamba down or something like that at a higher rate, you're probably not going to be putting peas or lentils after it, but it does open up some possibilities.
And especially for pasture, of course. I mean, so you sort of see those where, you're putting something in the, even like relay cropping, and sort of companion cropping, so that second crop maybe is for pasture or possibly feed, and that's one that on irrigation has been kind of fairly common for, like sort of feedlot alley where they're trying to get, if they're not growing corn, they'll be growing, you know, a barley silage or a triticale silage, you know, spring triticale underseeded to an annual ryegrass, and sometimes putting in some of the legumes, and then, you know, getting out there in the fall with the second silage or getting the cattle out there. We didn't talk about soil biology very much here. I don't know. It's like, but I mean, one of the things. So if we have a minute, Ken, I don't know how is our time. Yep, we're okay. So I mean, the other thing is that I think we recognize that there are some benefits to having a bit more diversity, and I think Andy kind of mentioned, you know, we've got a non-mycorrhizal crop like a mustard or a canola, so we throw in a legume in there, and so part of the thing is that we know that there's these benefits. I mean, some of those things are really hard to quantify, but we know when we look at the biological diversity below ground on some of these systems, we start to see some sort of synergies happening. And that whole question about can mycorrhiza or other microflora, you know, help us to move nitrogen between species, that's a feature of that is, again, probably more common in sort of native or in perennial systems, you know, in terms of the sloughing, in terms of even, you know, moving, you know, mycorrhiza, you know, organisms that, you know, that are associated with both plants and moving nitrogen. But I think a bigger thing too, in terms of just, you know, in terms of enhancement to the next crop, so you're balancing that with water, but you're also saying, are there some microbial benefits that we can accrue to that following crop? Again, tougher to quantify those, and when we're in a kind of a dry drought cycle, it's going to be even tougher to do that. But we think there are some benefits, and I think some of that's kind of showing up if you follow Twitter and go on YouTube with, you know, people like, you know, Gabe Brown is sort of the classic who's kind of toured through our part of the world, and some of the sort of enhancements in terms of soil quality and soil biology that they've been able to see with the combination of crop diversity, but also with grazing in that system. And so, yeah, beyond kind of the scope of what we're going to talk about here today, or certainly what we could show today, but that's something that we want to keep looking at and thinking about, you know, as we go forward. So,
kind of relate to the question, do you think there might be some carryover residual benefits into the next crop rotation when you have these nitrogen fixing crops and the intercropping?
Can you repeat the question too, Andy?
Yeah, carryover benefits into the crop rotation, especially I think with if you're talking about intercropping with brassicas where you have a non-mycorrhizal host. I think if you do have a companion or an intercrop with there, you at least are keeping that level the same rather than going into the background levels. So maybe there's a benefit in that way. Some of the stuff I've read is we've messed up our soils so well, we're in the background levels anyway with some of this beneficial soil biology, but at least we're not knowingly trying to wreck it anymore, hopefully.
The flip side of that is that, you know, I mean, for how many agronomists, you know, went to school, and I think we still believe that, you know, sanitation is an important feature of rotation, right? So we say we want to grow canola, and then we want to be 2 years out, or, well, 1 year out in central Alberta, 3 years out down here maybe. And so we say, yeah, we want to be, you know, a full 2 or 3 years out for, you know, a number of disease issues that we have, blackleg, clubroot, whatever. So what happens when we start mixing all of these things? Likewise with the Phanomyces, and so this is just sort of the cautionary thing, is that a number of the legume species share that organism and can move it and maintain it in the rotation. It's one that we've sort of just, again, it's a caveat to say that we got to be thinking about that and watching that, because the whole idea of, you know, growing a monoculture this year and then we're going to be 2 or 3 years out before we're back in with that monoculture, we're starting to have to rethink that when we think about intercropping and mixing these species. So it's something that we need to be watching, and I think we have to be watching that a bit more carefully in our wetter areas or under irrigation. So.
And that's the question that comes up is, well, if I grow peas and canola together, do I still have to be 3 years out of peas and canola or canola, or can we tighten up rotations because we have a plant health benefit or a soil health benefit? And I think those answers are still forthcoming. We don't know for sure on some of that, especially with your soil-borne diseases. So much is climate dependent, especially with something like a Phanomyces. But are we just going to set ourselves up for more trouble than, or is there a benefit to that there? So.
And luckily Mike Harding wasn't here yet to answer those tough questions, or to
I'm
ask
glad you
those
brought
tough
it up.
questions.
That was my question. Now I don't have to ask it. But I do have one more. Is, you know, we talked about the herbicides already, but what about managing volunteers and increasing risk of further herbicide resistance? Because I think that's a bit of a scary unknown as well.
Yeah, and I mean herbicide resistance. Anytime we're talking Clearfield, Group 2s, we're definitely. I don't know if we can increase herbicide resistance in kochia anymore, but yeah, as soon as we start doing this, we're starting to take some of our options away. We're maybe losing our Group 4s, our Group 27s, things like that. So it's something that has to be looked at for more than just I can make more money. I mean, we have to do that in all aspects of our ag decision making. Is this just going to make me more money, or what is it going to do down the road? So. Definitely some things there. It's also going to limit some of the pre-emerge stuff that we can put on with our pre-seed burn-off. We're not going to be able to put on, I don't know, stuff like 2,4-D on some of this ground, just because some of those companions or some of those intercrops will probably be affected by it. So there's decisions that usually you don't have to make that you have to now consider. Any other questions? Okay.
Well, join me in thanking Rob and Andy.